Hey everybody, my name's David Lutz. I'm a research professor in the Environmental Studies program at Dartmouth College. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do every day and kind of my path to how I chose this profession. And I'm going to show you some of the tools I work with. Then you can see what I kind of do as a professor and a scientist. So, my main job consists of two main parts. And the first is teaching students and helping students learn. I teach a couple of classes. I teach a course on global environmental science and introduction to environmental science. So those are two courses that you would take if you were to go to college and you wanted to become more interested in the subject. Or if you get to high school, you take AP environmental science. That's essentially the course I'll be teaching this year. I also work with students one-on-one when they become juniors or seniors in college and they want to do independent study projects. So they want to perform their own experiments and look at different aspects of the environment. I help them with that. So that's one component of my job, is helping people learn, especially collegiate students. The other part of my job is to do research. And I'm an environmental scientist. My background and what I mostly focus on are forest ecosystems. So we have many of them here in New Hampshire and Vermont, and these are things I study. I study many components of them. I study how they're changing. I study how they're being affected by invasive pests or climate change. I monitor them with a bunch of different technologies. And I do two things with my research. I try to figure out how the environment is changing and how we can adapt what we're doing to this changing environment. And another element is trying to figure out how these ecosystems and how the environment fundamentally work. There are many things we don't know about nature, and part of my job doing research is to learn more so that as a society we can think about how we're managing natural resources and how we coexist with nature. My job is really pretty fun. The things I like about it, I love to learn, and I'm very curious. So there's always fun things for me to think about reading more about. I like computers and technology. I grew up playing a lot of video games. It was a long time ago, so they're different than they are now. But I've always liked to become very comfortable with computers and technology, and that's something that I use today. It just so happens that I use that in the context of learning about the outdoors and nature. For example, I use lots of imagery taken from satellites that are flying around the planet in conjunction with NASA. We think about how forests all over New England or Alaska are changing. And we can see that with that technology, but we need computers to be able to process the data. Other things I like are I really like to teach and help people learn. So this has been a particularly tough time here at Dartmouth, and with the current situation, because I'm mostly not able to see my students and interact with them in the same way that I normally do. I really enjoy teaching, and I really like students' faces when they learn something for the first time, or they really figure something out. It's just a wonderful feeling. So that's another component that I really like about my job. And I like to discover new things. So I really like when I learn something new that nobody else has found before, or nobody else has kind of explored before, and I'm kind of revealing something or solving a puzzle. It's very satisfying. So a typical day for me kind of depends on what I'm teaching. In college, you have terms or quarters at Dartmouth. When I'm teaching, I generally teach, an hour or two for 3 times a week and have office hours. So I'm really interacting with students quite a bit. In the downtime, there's a lot of preparation that goes into teaching a course, which you might not think about until you have to do it. You're really spending hours getting the material, thinking about the quizzes, thinking about tests. Am I assessing, my students, appropriately? Am I teaching them things that they need to learn? Am I asking them questions so I really actually know how well they know the material? That takes quite a lot of time as well as grading, putting together my lectures, meeting with the students. So that's a big chunk of the day. Otherwise, when I'm doing my research, there's a lot of different parts that go into it. There's either, I can be doing field work where I'm actually going outside doing data collections. I'm collecting measurements in the field, which is really fun because I get to go out to my field sites and hike around and collect data. I get to be outside in really remote places, and that's really fun. Other components of research are thinking about analyzing data, which inevitably means thinking about how the data exists on computers and doing statistical tests with that data. So there is a bunch of computing work, and also a lot of writing and reading. Obviously, when we find something new or we do a new test, we'd like to write it up and tell that and share that information with other researchers, government agencies, and people around the world. We're learning new information and we'd like to share it, so we have to make sure we're communicating appropriately, so effectively too. So we're writing a lot, and I really like working with other scientists. You meet the most the most enjoyable people ever, when you're doing work in environmental science. People who study lakes, people who study wildlife, people who study glaciers, even other planets. It is pretty fun to talk to really knowledgeable people. You're always learning new things. What might make a student a good fit for this line of work? Being a scientist at an academic level, you generally have to be quite curious, because you're always learning new things, and there isn't necessarily someone to tell you the answer. You're doing things that no one has been able to solve. So you have to be very kind of curious and skillful in how you think about setting up a question, but you also have to be very determined. The reasons that we don't know some elements about the environment, and that's because sometimes it can be very frustrating and take time, so you have to be very determined and patient. If you really like to read and you really like to learn new things, you can always read through new pieces of information. You like learning, reading trivia or all sorts of different things like that. That's also very helpful. Anymore, the environmental science world and environmental biology is mostly done on computers, or a large component of it is. And there's also field work as well, but generally having strong mathematics backgrounds or working with computers can be very helpful. It's not imperative, but anymore, most data is online or on a machine. And so being able to sort through it is much faster, when you're using a spreadsheet program rather than doing it by hand, right? And liking to read and write. There's a lot of reading. I'm reading papers, I'm reading what other scientists are telling me, or telling the world about their findings, and I'm using that to think of new ideas to go explore other things. If I read journal articles about a certain subject, I may say, hey, I have an idea, they haven't collected here, or they haven't thought of this. I will go and try to do that kind of research. And if I don't read what other people are doing, then I won't know. So there's a lot of reading and writing. And so it's a little difficult to show you what I do these days. I'm not at college. I'm working from home like many professors are. But I do have something that I can show you here in my house that I work on. And I do a lot of work these days with the United States Forest Service. Basically our goal, and you may have been hearing about fires that are out west in California and Oregon. The Forest Service manages a lot of property and a lot of forests all over the place. It's very difficult for them to find out when forests are very dry, especially the leaf litter and the forest floor, which you may have been hearing about in the news. And that's because forests cover large areas and generally there aren't a lot of people there. What I work with is automated sensing systems. So some of you may have become familiar with the Internet of Things or different types of little devices these days. Now they quite often will have them in shop classes, tech ed classes, in high school, sometimes even middle school. And this is a computer chip. There's a little computer chip, and it's hooked up to a circuit board, and I can write a program that I upload into this device that I can connect to a bunch of different environmental sensors. So a couple of these sensors that I'll show you may look kind of funny, but they're really important. So here's a good one. This is a little device. You can see these wires here that measures air temperature and relative humidity. And so what I would do is I take these wires and I'd basically thread them into these little pins here, and then I'd write a computer code and I'd tell this machine to take measurements every 15 minutes or so. I'd go walk out, hike into the middle of the forest, I'd have a battery and a solar panel on it. It would collect data, it would store on a little SD card, and I could come back 2 months later and I could look at that information. I could find out what conditions were like in that location. So this is kind of something you would do for air temperature. There's a couple of other things here. This is a little set of kind of ceramic wafers, and what this does, if you were to put this in the soil, it tells you how tightly the water is held in soil. And we're actually in a drought right now. So as there's less and less water available in soil, the water will adhere to the soil surfaces, and it becomes more and more tense. There's pressure that builds up, and it makes it more difficult for plants to actually get water out of the soil. This little device tells us what that value is. So what I can do is I can put this in soil, or let's say in national forest. I can hook it up to my little machine here. I can put it in a little enclosure. I can take measurements, and I can take that information and I can send it back to campus where I can monitor things. So if I notice that things are very, very dry, it might be a higher likelihood that some of the plants are going to die. People use this in agriculture all the time. They monitor their crops. Another cool device here is a little device that tells us how much sun there is. It's called photosynthetically active radiation. Might sound like a lot, but it's basically a little device that if you let it sit up at the sky, it monitors how much energy is coming from the sun. You might not think that matters too much, but in an agricultural system, you would really rely on these kinds of readings to know what your crop yield would be, because the more sun there is, if there's appropriate amount of water and nutrients, your crops will put on more biomass. So if I was growing a cornfield and I was taking a measurement in the middle of a cornfield, hooked up to my little device, right? I come back a little bit later, I say, hey, it's been really, really sunny. Well, that's great. I might need more nutrients or more water. I might need to put that out on my field. There's a lot of people that use this information these days, not just in environmental science, but in agriculture, orchards, even in animal husbandry. So those are a couple of my tools that I would use when I would go install things. The last one is kind of looks dangerous actually, but it's just a set of prongs. This is another type of scientific instrument. I would go and I would put this into a log or soil. I would write a piece of code in this chip that would command this sensor to send electricity through here and come back up. Depending on how much water is in the soil, it will interfere with how fast that information comes back. I figure out how much water is in the soil, right? That's also really important because if I keep a network of that on my farm or in a forest, I'll know when I need to put either more water there or when conditions are right for a fire to go through. It's very difficult to get this information in the forest, so we're thinking of these kinds of low-cost technologies so that we can put networks of these up so people can plan a little bit easier. So those are just some of the kind of technologies I thought I could show you. If this were a different situation, I'd just take you out in the woods. We could go look around and see new things. The last little cool thing about this too is that you can hook up cameras or recorders to this. I have one iteration of this that will has a little microphone, and it will record sound and store it as a file on this machine. And what I'll do is I'll go put that all over the woods. I'll have it turn on every morning, and I'll capture what birds are singing. And I'll know what birds are around. And so if you're monitoring bird populations, if there's something that's endangered, we were looking at how things are changing, I can collect that information. I don't even need to be there. I can just put that there. I can come back later, collect the data. So yeah, so those are just, it's pretty fun. It's fun to use your hands. My students often are crossing between engineering and environmental science. And many of you may have these kinds of things that are available. Arduino is one version of them. There's also something called the Raspberry Pi. And these are starting to become more ubiquitous in middle schools and high schools for students to use. So I use them now, and I work with NASA and the Forest Service to try to collect information for them. You know, the last thing I'll say, just to wrap up, so I don't keep you all too long, is just kinds of things that you can do if this seems interesting to you, if it seems interesting to think about the environment or ask questions or try to solve problems related to environmental science, be it climate change or invasive species or things like that. You know, there's a couple of bullets that I wrote down to think about. One is becoming pretty familiar with the outdoors. If you like being outside, you like biology, you like nature, it's one thing to read in a book, it's another thing to experience it and think about it and think about questions you may have. So it's not an absolute requirement, but it's pretty important to become pretty familiar with being outside. Science courses are really important. So I took lots of biology, I took chemistry courses, I took physics courses, mathematics courses, all through schooling. I went to college and graduate school as well. And so the environment is many things. There's chemistry, there's physics, you know, there's obviously biology, and you really need to understand all those pieces to know what's going on in the environment. So science courses were pretty important. I'm particularly technological in the sense that I use computers a lot. I use satellite, I look at satellite information, I look at data from these things. It's all on computers. As I was saying, I played a lot of video games when I was growing up. I got used to working with computers in the 80s and 90s, and so working with that format was very helpful. Now they have lots of coding classes. It makes it very easy to access, and those skills are pretty important because data, there's a lot of data out there in the environment, and so you have to learn how to interact with it. And another really important thing is just to think about, you know, at home is thinking about setting up your own experiments, collecting data, being curious, solving problems. You can be a scientist just by setting up your own experiment every day. You could keep track of how long you sleep every day. Every day you just keep track of how long what time you woke up, what time you went to bed, how long you slept. Keep track for 2 weeks, you have a data set. You can answer questions about that. Did I stay up late, you know, watching TV? Did I drink coffee? Did I go to bed early? What days did I go to sleep early or stay up? And what were the conditions that led that to happen? Those are basic questions that you can ask that you don't have to have a dissertation, you know, or be a professor to ask that. You can be a scientist just by the process of collecting data and thinking about questions. So that's one thing you can do to start, is just to set up experiments. And there are many different organizations out there that you can work with or volunteer with where you will be collecting that kind of information. So whether that be an outdoor group, an outdoor advocacy group, even a town manager, if you're thinking about collecting data on, you know, water moving through your town, how much water is available, or working at a farm. There are lots of different occupations you can have where you get familiar with collecting data and then analyzing trends. And that's what science is, right? is asking questions and finding the proper way to analyze information that you have to answer them sufficiently. So that's kind of, a little bit about me, a little bit about what it means to be a professor in environmental science, environmental studies. And I'd be happy to talk to you if you have other questions. You can get my information, and I can share more. So thanks for listening to me, and I hope you guys learned something, and have a great day.